All right, I think we're good to go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. I am Suzanne Wuns. I'm the Executive Director of the Harvard Law School Library, and on behalf of the library, I'd like to thank you all for coming for today's talk. I'd also like to thank June Casey for organizing today's event, and the Dean's Office for providing the delicious lunch, which I hope you all enjoy as we have this very interesting conversation. So just a few, I think we've covered all the housekeeping, actually, so I think we're good to go. And I will just go ahead and introduce our authors and panelists. So our two authors are Gabriella Blum and Benjamin Wittes. Gabriella Blum is the Rita E. Hauser Professor of Human Rights and Humanitarian Law at Harvard Law School. She specializes in public international law, international negotiations, the law of armed conflict, and counterterrorism. She's also the co-director of the HLS Brookings Project on Law and Security and a member of the Program on Negotiations Executive Board. Benjamin Wittes is a senior fellow in governance studies at the Brookings Institution and the editor-in-chief of Lawfare. And joining our two authors, we have Professor Yochai Benkler, the Jack N. and Lillian R. Berkman Professor of Entrepreneurial Legal Studies and faculty co-director of the Berkman Center for Internet and Society, and also Professor Jack Goldsmith, the Henry L. Shattuck Professor of Law. So thank you all for coming, and I will hand it over to Benjamin.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me, and thank you all for turning out. This is quite overwhelming. Gabby and I started out thinking we were writing a book about the governance of catastrophic risk, and rather to my surprise anyway, though I'm not certain to Gabby's, we ended up writing a book that was as much a book of political theory as anything else, which is odd for me because I actually had never really studied political theory. And so I want to talk about sort of how we got there a little bit and what we ended up thinking about and some of the sort of head-scratching questions of governance of what we call a world of many-to-many threats and defenses, or as I sometimes, pejoratively or reductionistly reduce it to, a world in which anyone can attack anyone from anywhere. So I want to start with three, we might call hypotheticals, except they're not really hypothetical. They're all real events that happened about which I'm going to change one fact. And each one, I think, illustrates some portion of the world and the security environment that we're now talking about, or that if we're not yet quite talking about, we will be very soon, or we're sort of on the spectrum to talking about. So the first is I want to change one fact about the anthrax attacks that followed the September 11th attacks by a few weeks or months. The anthrax attacks, as you will remember, involved an individual later identified after 7 years, identified by the FBI, but never brought to trial, who sealed anthrax in a set of envelopes and mailed them through the U.S. mail. Along the way, killed a number of postal workers through seepage in the envelopes, and killed some of the people who the envelopes were addressed to. I believe that altogether 7 people were killed. Now, if you're going to mass distribute highly refined anthrax, mail is a very inefficient way to do it because you're actually sealing stuff inside something. You don't disseminate it to large numbers of people. And you're sending it to an individual. So we thought, well, what if instead of doing that, he had gotten himself one of these increasingly ubiquitously available small drones and flown the same anthrax over a crowded stadium. Now, this may sound improbable, except that if you look at the recent security around the Super Bowl, they actually imposed a no drone fly zone for a couple hundred miles around the Super Bowl because they were afraid of exactly, not necessarily a biodistribution, but exactly that sort of means of attack. So I think if that had happened, you would have had something like 50,000 people simultaneously infected. and many of them probably would have died. And then today, nobody would doubt, I think, a proposition that we assert in the book, but I think a lot of people regard as an alarmist proposition, which is that it's perfectly possible for any one of you to have your own weapons of mass destruction program. And that's really the first time in the history of the world that that's true. Second, hypothetical, not so hypothetical. Imagine that the BP oil disaster in 2010 had been caused not by an accidental explosion, but by an intentional act. Same volume of oil spills, same damage to the coast, same. Now this is actually not remotely an unrealistic scenario. In fact, the day that the explosion happened, the working assumption inside of much of the US federal government was that we were dealing with a terrorist attack. And as one former official explained it to me, when we finally got the all clear that this was an accident, we all breathed a huge sigh of relief and said, okay, this is the EPA's problem, right? But that was not the working assumption at the moment that this happened. Now, I think a couple of things would become immediately apparent if you imagined that this was a terrorist attack or a, individual level attack. But, the first is this would be the most successful attack on the United States since 9/11, right? I mean, it killed 11 people, and it really despoiled a huge amount of natural resources. The damage in economic terms was immense, tens of billions of dollars. And the second thing you would notice is that the defense of the coastline of the United States was not handled by the United States government. The Coast Guard, the Navy were there as observers and sort of egging on a private, multinational, foreign-based corporation that was responsible for plugging the well, that was responsible for cleaning up the oil, and that was responsible in a meaningful kinetic sense for the defense of the coastline of the United States. That's a pretty remarkable thing, just in terms of the distribution. If you take the anthrax example as an example of the distribution of offensive capability, the hypothetical BP example is a really powerful example of the distribution of defensive responsibility. BP is formally under the statute, the responsible party in financial terms, but it was also in very real terms the responsible actor responsible for preventing the damage that it had caused and for cleaning it up. A third example is a real, and I apologize in advance for my description of it, quite awful individual level case out of Southern California. Involves a hacker named Luis Mijangos who had I guess the only words I know how to use for it is a kind of mass online sexual assault thing going. He wrote some malware which he distributed to young women and underage girls. The FBI has estimated there may be as many as 200 victims around Southern California. And the malware worked as follows. First of all, it almost as an afterthought, stole your credit card information, which, sort of in a garden variety kind of theft sort of way. But it also turned your webcam against you. And he would then take surreptitious pictures of people in various states of undress and then approach them with extortionate demands for them to produce sex tapes for him, and also use their contacts database to further distribute the malware. The FBI finally caught up with him. He's now serving time in prison. And so here's my one hypothetical change to that case. What if he was not within the territorial United States, but was based, as a lot of your spam comes from, Nigeria or some other, or Ukraine, or some other place where the jurisdictional reach of the FBI just doesn't go. And so I think what you would conclude from that is that you can actually be attacked at an individual level from just about anywhere. And that's also the first time in the history of the world that that's true. So I think we started with the idea that we wanted to unpack some of the connective tissues that linked the debates over cybersecurity with the debates over biosecurity, with the debates over drones and robotics. And what we found was that there's a cybersecurity debate with which a lot of you are, I'm sure, very familiar, in which people talk about the uniqueness of the cyber environment and the things they say that make it unique, make it different from anything else that's ever come before, is that you can attack remotely over great distances with limited capacity to attribute the attacks. Attribution is very difficult. Technology has disseminated down to the level of individuals and equalized kind of, in a Tom Friedman sort of way, the earth has gotten much flatter in an attacking framework. And then you talk to people who do biosecurity for a living, and they say, wow, this environment is so unusual because you can attack over great distances and with limited attribution, and almost anybody with a reasonable grad school level proficiency in lab techniques can do some pretty awful things. And you realize that they're actually describing the same set of effects. And so what we tried to do in this book was to kind of break through to a higher ground and describe the effects of what we call technologies of mass empowerment in A, distributing the ability to attack, B, distributing vulnerability to attack, and C, distributing the responsibility for defense. And the more we worked with this, the more we ended up with a puzzle that I have to say, having co-written this book, I'm still not remotely sure I know the answer to, which is how do you govern a world in which so many of our working assumptions about why we have governance, how it works, and what the role of the state in it is. I'm not going to sit here and say these aren't true anymore. I think a lot of people have spent a lot of time saying, the state is over. They've all been wrong. A lot of people have spent a lot of time, questioning whether, the world is going to end. And I'm not going to do that. But I am going to say a lot of our assumptions about the way we govern are a little bit less true than they used to be. And the question of what you replace them with becomes a real head scratcher. So I'm going to talk about one of those things, and then I'm going to turn it over to Gabby, who does the deep thinking in this relationship, to talk about some of the others. The one I want to talk about is the relationship between liberty and security. We have this very crude dichotomy in which we like to talk about liberty and security as kind of, pans in a scale, right? The scales of justice, right? And one of them is liberty and the other is security. And if you add a little bit to one side, the other side goes up. And somehow we've morphed privacy into this so that there's a third tray, or maybe the liberty tray is now the liberty and privacy tray. But there's an understanding, and you see this throughout the entire debate about NSA surveillance, for example, but a lot of these other sort of modern security dilemmas too. And people intone very seriously, we need to have a balance, right? We need to make sure that our pursuit of security does not upset the liberty-security balance. And inevitably, Ben Franklin ends up in this discussion. By the way, we have in the book a history of that Franklin quotation, which is actually a very interesting, it does not mean what people think it means. And one of the things that this set of technological developments had, made us really think about is that metaphor an appropriate one? Is that metaphor of balance an appropriate one? And so I've always had a problem with this metaphor because if you take it at face value, the freest place in the world, right, should be Somalia, because it has, or Yemen maybe this week, because it has the least security, right? And the most secure place in the world should be somewhere like North Korea, because it certainly doesn't have any liberty, right? And so there's something deficient about the metaphor as a baseline proposition. But as we started working in an area where it is not at all clear that the marginal increase in security does not produce also a marginal increase in liberty, we began having a really hard time with this metaphor. So let me give you a couple of examples, and then I will turn it over to Gabby. And I'm going to say this at the risk of upsetting Yochai, which I once did. So we assume that marginal increases in surveillance come at the expense of liberty. But we don't assume that actually in a lot of day-to-day life experiences. So one of the ways we have of avoiding this problem is by using words other than surveillance to describe surveillance that we like. So communities will, for example, demand greater surveillance on their street corners. But they'll call it, we want more cops on the street. We want community-oriented policing, right? They won't say, come surveil us. They will say, we want more cameras. So Kathy Lanier, who's the police chief in Washington, describes how she went from an environment where she initially had communities that really objected to the installation of cameras, to now communities asking, where are our cameras? Think also about airport security screening. This is something we all hate. I had to go through it this morning. And yet we do not say that going through that airport security screening diminishes our liberty, right? What we say is it's really inconvenient, it's really intrusive, and yet we feel somehow that it enables some greater freedom to travel. And that's why I think most people, despite the inconveniences and the indignities, actually accept it, and accept it rather ungrudgingly, given that the behaviors in question might otherwise be prosecutable as a sexual assault. So what I want to leave you with is this idea that this relationship is actually extremely complicated, this relationship between liberty, security, and privacy. It is not one of simple balancing. And as we migrate into a world in which you have to worry about more and more people's use of technologies of greater and greater power that can be, or you can expect might be, arrayed against you, the question of whether marginal security steps, including surveillance steps, make you less secure, less free, more secure, or more free, or some combination of those in a complex ecosystem is not a simple question, and it's not one that you can reduce to a simple balancing test.
So I'll just add a few words before we turn it to the panelists to tear us apart. Let's start from the first sort of axiomatic thing that we do say in the book. Technology, by and large, is a wonderful thing. Before we get to the threat side of the equation, let's just acknowledge it has improved our quality of life, our life expectancy, what we can do. It empowers us in wonderful, wonderful ways. And it empowers us so much that we become so dependent on it. And that dependency is part of what increases our vulnerability when people, again, for the most part, will use that technology to do the most noblest of things, but a small margin, and in a world of 7 billion people, a small margin is a big number, might use it to cause great harm. Now, even the question of harm really depends on where you stand, right? So we love the idea that political dissidents in Egypt or Hong Kong or in many other places have access to these kinds of technologies. We like it a little less when ISIS uses them to recruit sympathizers and people for their cause. So there's no question, part of the problem is that these technologies are double-edged, and they're double-edged twice in the sense of what you can do with them and who gets to do what with them. The other thing to remember is that it's not just individuals and groups or companies that benefit from technology. The government is a major beneficiary of technology. So it's not that the government stands still and becomes this very timid and vulnerable actor and very weak and everybody else is empowered. Everybody is becoming more powerful. What we don't know is who wins this arms race. And what we do know is that it turns out that it's much more difficult to defend yourself and your citizens, if you're the state and you owe these obligations to your citizens, against potentially billions of sources of threat. This may be an exaggeration, but a very high number of sources of threat simultaneously at all times. Some are domestic and some are foreign. And so what happens is, as Ben said, that a lot of sort of our basic distinctions, our basic dichotomies of how we've organized governance are becoming increasingly questionable. Think even the line between national security and personal security, how we think about our personal safety, safety from crime, versus our safety from terrorism or from an act of war. How do you know what the motivation behind the threat is? Does it matter? How does it matter? That also causes us to question who owes us security. In the traditional social contract, the state is empowered with and entrusted with the duty to protect us from each other and to protect us from external threats. Think now about companies, just the private sector. How much power has evolved into the private sector? Some of it we've given it, some of it they just got through technology and the market. What do they owe us? What do they owe you in terms of your security? What is the relationship between the government and the private sector in providing us as a collective with that security? What can the government demand of the private sector? What can you as consumers demand from the private sector? And finally, there is this territorial question. The traditional Leviathan was bounded by territorial boundaries. Each sovereign or each state is sovereign within its boundaries to determine its laws, its regulations, its enforcement mechanisms, its security and crime control policies. The more these threats cross boundaries, the more they are not bounded territorially, there is going to be a huge pressure on governments, certainly the capable government or the stronger governments, that wouldn't be true across the board, but on the stronger governments to reach beyond their borders, and either try to preempt threats or extend their power to citizens who are not their own. You could do that through legislation, just as the United States tried to do after 9/11 with the material support witness statutes. You can do it through surveillance. And there is an interesting question. What does the United States government owe German citizens or Brazilian citizens when it surveys them? It could do so through much more aggressive means, like abductions or targeted killings. And we predict in the book that we are going to see more of these unilateral actions across the board on the global level. And the only way to it's not going to completely counteract that, but as a check on that, a check on preventing the world from turning into the Wild West, What we need also is much more international cooperation, and real international cooperation, meaning moving beyond the sort of largely symbolic or intelligence sharing Interpol outfit to really thinking about cooperation in enforcement, cooperation in policing, cooperation in actual powers that allow foreign forces to effect arrests, to preempt threats on a much more global level. And that will then open the question not just to how we manage liberty, security, and privacy internally, how we regulate companies, how we regulate individuals, how we regulate intermediaries, but also raise difficult questions about what do governments owe foreign citizens, what do foreign citizens owe governments, and how do you manage security in not just a territorial place, but really a global place.
Thank you. You want me to go first? You want to go first? So this is a great book, and I urge you all to read it. It's a frightening book, and it's a scary book because it explores how the technologies that we've come to learn and love might be turned against us, and empower individuals or small groups around the world to do significant harm to us all. Ben described briefly the idea that individuals would have WMDs in their pockets. I want to just read a sentence from a thought experiment. This is from the book itself that James Fearon, a political scientist at Stanford, he 10 years ago wrote a short little paper about a thought experiment that is in some sense part of the theme of Gabby and Ben's book. We seem to be heading in the direction of a world in which every individual has the capacity to blow up the entire planet by pushing a button on his or her cell phone. Now, we're clearly not there yet. But Fearon was positing, and Gabby and Ben explore in great detail, if we continue certain trends that are empowering individuals in cyber context, and the ability of individuals around the globe to do harm on the other side of the globe, sometimes significant harm, is the easiest example to understand. The idea is that we're heading inexorably in this direction towards empowering individuals everywhere to do harm everywhere. Now, the hard question, and one that Gabby and Ben obviously can't answer for sure, is how close are we to Fearon's everyone having WMD button in their pocket, or to where we are today? And another question that you need to think about and figure out how much we worry about this, it may just be that, yes, these risks are growing, but they're not growing so much that we want to change anything that we're doing. It could be that living with these risks and the possibility of catastrophic risk at the very low probability of a catastrophic risk is worth accepting for all of the benefits we get from modern society and all of the restrictions that we want to keep on government that might be necessary to meet this threat to lower it more. So we don't really know, and I don't think the authors make strong claims about where we are on the spectrum from where we are today to Fearon's hypothetical. So I just want to make 3 quick comments about the book. The first one is the book talks a lot about distributed threats and distributed defenses. And while both Gabby and Ben in their talks nodded to the state and the state's continuing role, I think it's fair to say the book is skeptical about the state's ability to deal with these threats. And I just want to say, don't underestimate the state. The state has enormous capacities that are unexercised. We don't mistake the state's current restraint that is a function of the current set of values and the current trade-offs we're willing to take from what the state is able to do if it's unleashed. And the state is also maybe, at least within a territory, the only entity that has both the incentives. The problem with distributed defense is the individuals in the distributed defense tend not to have an incentive to protect the entire community. And that includes Verizon and all sorts of intermediaries, private intermediaries as well. The state does have that incentive, and the state has massive capacities. And it has massive capacities especially to regulate and surveil and scrutinize the channels of communication and distribution that are necessary for these distributed threats to work. So the first point is, don't underestimate the need for the state or the power for the state. And my prediction would be that if these threats come to pass and if they become to be as serious as we think they are, then the state will have a much heavier role. And the state will it's very slow to defend, but it's very powerful when it sets its mind to it. The second thing is that, as both authors discussed, surveillance will be, if the state does need more power to deal with this threat, surveillance will be the means of doing it. And I mean surveillance on a scale that we haven't seen yet. The kind of things we're debating in this country now, in light of the Snowden revelations, will seem like child's play, I think, if these threats really come to be materialized, come to be serious, if they start to happen. The demand will be for the state to do much more, and that will involve surveillance on a scale of communications and activities that now seems impossible, because the only way to defeat these threats, if they really are this monumental, or one important way, will be to stop them before they happen. And you've already heard directors of the NSA saying things like, the only way I can protect the network from cyber threats is to be in the network. They're thinking that the government is thinking this way now, and this is what will happen if these catastrophic threats occur. And the third and thing I want to say is that Gabby and Ben started writing this book before the Snowden revelations. I think that's right. Yep. And then, so the book kind of had to be adjusted a little bit. It was kind of consistent with what we learned from Snowden, but in light of Snowden. But I want to say that if the state has to do these things that I just suggested it might have to do, if the threats that Gabby and Ben posit are as great as they are, then I think that we will look back on the Snowden revelations as, the government might even look back on the Snowden revelations as a great thing. The Snowden revelations hurt the government a lot in the short term on many grounds. It hurt it on its collection capabilities, which are less effective. It hurt its trust. It made it look bad. Government looked silly defending itself almost. But the government has reacted to that, and one of the things that the intelligence communities have learned, and I think they've truly learned this from the Snowden revelations, is they can't be secretive like they used to be. They have to be much, much more transparent. It's necessary because the same tools that empower the state to surveil so effectively are enabling individuals to surveil the state. The state can't keep secrets anymore. So it's inevitable that this is going to happen. And it's inevitable that if we're going to give the state the powers that I think are going to be needed to deal with these threats, if they occur, which I don't know if they will, then that's only going to happen on conditions of, I think, radical transparency. And I think actually the checks and balances system we have now, in theory, are the right ones, but it's the absence of transparency, the absence of knowing what they're doing in the homeland that will change dramatically, and Snowden will be viewed as the starting point for that conversation.
Okay, thanks. I'm on this panel because when Gabi first presented a portion of this book at the faculty workshop, my response was, this is a dangerous book. And so you know already that Gabi and Ben are intellectually robust and open and engaging people to ask me to come and explain why it's a dangerous book here and see how the finished product responds. And so that's what I'm going to try to do in a few minutes. The book is dangerous because we are at the end of about a decade and a half worth of American response to the moment of 9/11 and its panic. And in that panic, the unleashing of an extremely powerful national security establishment from bounds of both reason and law. The torture program did not make us any more secure, nor did it add to liberty. Guantanamo has not made us more secure, nor did it add to liberty. Breaking into Senator Feinstein's staff report, working on the report on torture, did not make us any more secure nor add liberty. And yet not a single person has been held to account for any of these, while others have been put in prison for whistleblowing on things that happened. So we are operating in an environment in which what is very much at contest is whether fear can justify not the state in the abstract or Leviathan in political theory, but a certain class of organizations with their own internal organizational dynamic, their own groupthink that we've seen failed in identifying WMD in Iraq, failed in the context of torture, lied about it, and tried to work around it. Can we legitimate the extension of power of those organizations over the very platforms that we exist? two of the most respected experts in national security law, the authors of this book, write a piece that begins with 80 pages of really scary near-term dystopian sci-fi. So that's very scary, and it sets up fear conditions that cloud our judgment. So I would love for this book to have been written from the end to the beginning, because Gabi and Ben end the book with a nuanced, balanced, complex understanding of the risks and dangers of the state, of its failures, at least some of them, over the last decade and a half. They extol the potential virtues of distributed defense that is not centralized in the state, and the possibility of the state to help or not help. There's chapter 8 that goes into liability of software providers and a variety of solutions that will distribute security in the way that we understand it, with locks and alarm systems and private security and resilience to sometimes knowing that you lose things like your credit card number and still you don't lose everything that you want. And then if you work back, you get to the nub of the issue, or the nub of my concern, of the danger. Chapter 7, which essentially justifies platform surveillance. And that's exactly what I want to emphasize from what Jack said. If you believe that it is fact, not near-term sci-fi, that every person on the planet will have a nuclear weapon capability in their pocket, and that anyone could kill millions of people tomorrow, however insanely marginal they are, then the solution or the cost embedded in platform surveillance, seeing everyone, interjecting with everyone, intervening with everyone, is plausible. If you also believe that you have an accountable system, they identify at the end of chapter 7 here, what do you want from such a system? You want the risk to be high enough to justify it. You want it to be non-discriminatory, and you want it to be accountable. One of the things we learned from the Snowden revelations, from the opinions of the courts, is that the system is only extremely imperfectly accountable. Again and again, we read opinions where the court says, for the last 3 years, you've been telling me X, now I found out that Y, the whole thing, let me throw it out the window, come back with a new one. Which is remarkable, by the way, for the court to have that backbone to say, but it also describes the limitations of such a system. So the accountability is really problematic, not in the context of the state, the democratic and rule of law state generally, but in the context of national security. The non-discrimination, we know, for example, from the New York Police Department's infiltration of Muslim student organizations, doesn't exist. And the question of threat is where the first 80 pages of the book, I think, raise a real concern. Because just as the stories that you told now, they are slightly sci-fi adapted versions of things that we've seen, not data, not case studies. And in some sense, the question, the factual question that I want to know is, why not? It's not as though these capabilities aren't there yet. There are enough capabilities of poisoning the water for a very long time. And so that's, to me, the core question I have for you is, how do we know what is fear that will cloud judgment and what is not? How do we understand the systematic failures of real accountability, not awkwardness, in a system that systematically refuses to bring anyone to justice, even when we know they've done things that are illegal, even when they lied to Congress under oath, etc. We know there's no accountability. So it's not the state, it's this particular set of organizations that take up about 4% of GDP and 2% of the American workforce, that have a very strong incentive. President Eisenhower talked about the military-industrial complex 50 years ago. in conversation with what are really interesting political theory questions that I'm happy to get into, and I disagree on various issues, but that's not what makes this book either important or dangerous at the present moment. I think what makes it important and dangerous is the role that it plays in the public debate at this particular historical moment, as the US is trying to understand the growth in power that is largely unaccountable of a national security establishment that is getting more resources and getting more aggressive under this idea and getting deeper and deeper into the state as we continue to fail to distinguish between war making and crime, between the ethic of crime fighting and the resilience we're willing to show of we lose a lot more people to murder than to terrorism. We are willing to absorb that for a certain kind of state. Meshing the two, as you do, to show the threat also pushes us in the direction of being less resilient and less willing to accept, to absorb. So that's my primary worry about this book.
Okay, so there's a lot of stuff on the table, and having had a heads up on none of it, I'm gonna wing it. All right, so the first on one of the questions we really struggled with as we worked on this book was how legitimate is it to use a series of hypotheticals as basically the factual, not the factual foundation of the book, because the factual foundation of the book is actually the existence and growth of a set of technologies that enable things. But Yochai's point that we have not seen these catastrophic events happen, and given the existence and prevalence of the technology, the question of why not is, and why are we using a set of hypotheticals rather than data, is a totally legitimate question, and I want to be really candid about the answer. I don't know why this stuff hasn't happened yet. The more I read about in the bio literature about what you can do, the less I understand why all these terrorists are so infatuated with suicide bombings. It seems really boring to me. And I think you could get a lot more, no pun intended, or maybe pun intended, bang for your buck if you read some of this literature. And it's all out there in the public domain. And it is mystifying to me why, and something of a mercy, that terrorists seem to be as unimaginative as they are. And I've had to have had some real sort of conversations with myself. Why don't they do things that are more ambitious? So and then it turns out that actually Yochai and I are both understating that. So I asked a molecular biologist friend of mine about my anthrax distribution by drone hypothetical. And he looked at me like I was sort of juvenile and said, that's a terrible overinvestment in technology. And I said, what do you mean? And he said, well, if you just took a paper bag of the stuff and kind of released it into the wind through your fingers at a stadium, you'd have exactly the same effect. You don't need the drone. He said, you can drive through the streets going like this. So I do think part of the answer to that question is a mystery, and maybe the answer is, so let me pose three possible answers. One is that human beings are much less nasty than Gabby and I think, and that there are really very few people who want to do truly awful things to society in general. Lots of people want to attack individuals. That's why we have a gun problem and a domestic violence problem, right? And we have lots of problems that arise from the desire of individuals to hurt other individuals. But the number of people who actually want to, in a mad scientist swirling a flask and then I shall destroy the world, is actually really limited. And the number of them who are then capable, the percentage of those limited universe of people who want to do really awful things, who are then capable of getting anywhere near doing it, is really limited. And it takes, one of these, Ted Kaczynski or Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, or if you believe the FBI, Mr. Ivins. It takes one of these real sort of violence entrepreneurs to take one of these ideas and how can we turn a little wooden box into a bomb, right? And that's actually a project that requires a lot of imagination. How can we kill 3,000 people with box cutters? And it takes a certain type of mind that's actually very, very rare to do these sorts of things. That's one possibility. A second possibility, which is the one I favor, having perhaps a darker view of humanity than Yochai does, is that terrorists are not very imaginative people. And the suicide bombing, which sort of caught on in the early 80s and early 90s, was unheard of basically before that. And it worked, and so everybody replicates what worked last time. And you need a demonstration project that one of these things is possible before somebody really do it. Third possibility is you look at the cyber arena and you say, actually, Yochai's premise is wrong. There's a huge amount of cyber attacks. The proliferation has, in fact, empowered states, individuals, small groups to go and attack lots of people, and that's exactly what they're doing. And what we have not seen is the truly catastrophic example of this. But, we're operating in an environment with, what's equivalent of a sort of massive street crime kind of environment with some higher level actors engaged too. I want to say a quick few words about the question of that Jack raised, which is, is this problem addressable and at what level of energy by the state? I would not describe myself, as Jack did, as skeptical of the state in its power to address some of these issues. In fact, what I would say is I think the adaptations, and one of the things, by the way, that convinced me of the state's energy and power in this area was the book that Jack wrote with Tim Wu, and specifically a single chapter of that where they describe the power that the state brought to bear on the internet and how all the people in the 90s who were writing these, in retrospect, quite delusional texts about how the internet represented the end of the state were, quite wrong once the state started exerting its authority over servers that were located in their jurisdictions. Here's what I am skeptical of. I am skeptical of the state's ability within the confines of our current set of expectations of the way the state behaves to address these issues. And I think once you start asking yourself the question, what would the state have to do in order to address some of these questions? And this goes back to Yochai's question is, do you want the state doing these things? It's not obvious at all what the answer to that question is. The answer is that begs a set of questions about the nature of the social contract as it has developed and as it might continue to develop. We conclude by saying we're not ready to bet against the Leviathan, that the Leviathan's still a pretty fierce beast when he bears his fangs. Do Leviathans have fangs? So look, there are people in the world, and some of them are quite eminent. Martin Rees, who's the former Astronomer Royal of Britain, and wrote a book boldly predicting that the human race has only a 50-50 chance, less than a 50-50 chance of surviving this century. And part of the reason was climate change, but part of the other reason was catastrophic technologies. And he basically said, we've already passed the point where we've made these choices. There's really nothing we can do about it now. We're just kind of waiting to be wiped out. It reminded me a little bit of that scene in Annie Hall where the child Woody Allen is Alvy Singer is taken to the doctor because he won't do his homework because he's learned that the universe is expanding, right? And the doctor says, why won't you do your homework? And he says, what's the point? And that's kind of Martin Rees's attitude toward trying to govern this stuff. Our attitude is different. Our attitude is, look, Alvy Singer's got to do his homework, and the problem of how to govern a world in which the security dilemmas have gotten a lot harder can't be to sort of throw up your hands and say, what's the point? One last point, which is the question of alarmism. So this is the second sort of launch event we've done for the book. The first one we did at Brookings a couple of weeks ago, and we asked Ben Weisner from the ACLU, who's sort of a civil libertarian sparring partner of mine of long acquaintance and friendship, to come talk about the book. And I fully expected him to give exactly the talk that Yochai did. And to my surprise, he argued something else entirely, which is, first of all, that he did not regard any of the hypotheticals as improbable or unlikely. He thought they were all technically realistic. Number two, that he thought that the book was alarmed but not alarmist. And three, that his real worry about the book was not what it said, but that some of the discussion about it wouldn't be as measured as we were in it. And I take both that concern and Yochai's concern that we've sort of stoked that a little bit by writing some scary stuff up front at face value. I do think, however, that if you believe that the examples are within the realm of technical plausibility, and they're not very far from things that have actually happened, you have to ask the question whether when something seems like it's inevitable, it's because it is, or whether there's some extrinsic reason why the problem has stopped at the level that it has.
And I'll just add a couple of quick words before we open it up. I think Yochai is utterly correct that we focus so much in our daily conversations about terrorism, but if you think about the incidents or the casualties of terrorism, we're talking about an average of 20 a year, whereas we have 13 to 17,000 cases of homicide every year. So it's a real puzzle why we focus so much on terrorism rather than ordinary crime. And in that, he's utterly correct. And it's certainly true that it doesn't take sophisticated technologies to kill people. We know that. I think our concern is that one form of violence doesn't replace another. It just adds to the pool. So you might think that it takes a different kind of person to actually come up close to someone, behead another human being, rather than use some clicks on a keyboard or a remotely piloted drone, and that distance and that mediating technology just makes it more possible for more people to do more harm. And in that sense, I almost I don't like focusing on the worst case scenario of the nuclear bomb in the pocket, just like I didn't like it when people invoke the debates or try to focus the debates over torture on the dirty bomb scenario. I think it really clouds the real discussion of what do you do when how do you know when the threat has stopped being bearable, that we can't really just think about resilience, even though we talk about resilience, but the resilience doesn't solve the problem. And there is a real threat. It may not be nuclear size, it may not be an annihilation of the human race, but it does require more steps by the government and in terms of policing. And I agree with you, and we say Locke, we focus on Hobbes because he was such a better writer than Locke, but it's true that Locke got it more right than Hobbes, and sort of acknowledging that the government itself is a source of the threat. But just as I think about policing, the fact that the police gets it wrong, and gets it wrong often maybe, doesn't mean we do away with the police. We think about how to make it better, how to adjust, how to adapt. I'm not going to defend the post 9/11 response. I think many of your concerns are correct. I don't think it exhausts the conversation. And the very last point is urging us all. We tend to say the state, and we mean the United States. And this is in some ways a response to Jack, and in some ways just reinforces Yochai's concern. So here's another way to sort of express Yochai's concerns, take them even further. You're concerned about the US government response. We could be even more concerned about other governments' response, would take our threat scenarios or our threat perception and use them just as a mean of oppression. And Jack has written about this in the context of cybersecurity and the concerns there. But we are dealing in a world where there are 193 UN members. And the U.S. Institute of the Fund for Peace lists at least 45 of them as on high alert for fragile or non-existing governance structures. And we can't just think about what the United States can or will do in the face of threat. We need to think about what happens in a world where these essentially are subcontractors for security. These other states we have to rely on for governance, providing essential services for their own citizens, first and foremost, but also preventing harms from migrating, no longer function or cannot function. And then the debates and the discussions about states' capabilities versus the outside threats look very, very different from where you sit here and think about the US government capability vis-a-vis potential sources of threats. So now we would welcome your questions, and if you can wait for the mics.
Hi, thanks. My name's Hassan. I'm an LLM student. So I have kind of two kind of related questions. The first relates to the point you were just discussing about the power of the state, but it's more to do with the kind of argumentative strategy that I take you to be employing in the book. So one possibility is that one could write a different book which has a kind of parallel structure which is like this. You say, well, there are all these terrifying technologies, and here are all these ways that the state could abuse them, and 80 pages of hypotheticals and so on, and then that kind of creates this huge argumentative burden about what then to do about that threat. And it seems to me, I haven't read the book unfortunately yet, but it seems to me that just from the way you describe it, the concern is that the decks are kind of stacked, because the concern is kind of set up from one side, namely dangerous private actors, and then the question is what is the appropriate response to that, rather than just saying, well, there are threats from these private actors, but there are also threats that could emanate from the government, and then what is the appropriate response? And just one further point on the nature of the government threat, in particular in relation to the point about surveillance. It seems to me that the disanalogy between the real threat of massive surveillance and the examples Ben gave is that the threat of mass surveillance is kind of pervasive in a way that those examples are not. So, airport checks or even security cameras that you see as you walk past a particular street. It seems to me that the threat of very, very powerful forms of mass surveillance is that they inhabit kind of every element of your day-to-day life and erode the private sphere in a way that those examples kind of don't bring out. So I wondered if you could just speak to perhaps those points a bit.
Right. So, first of all, I fear that we have slightly bought in too much to Yochai's characterization of 80 pages of hypotheticals about individuals with access to technology. It is true that the book starts with a few hypotheticals. The first 3 chapters are not hypothetical. They are accounts of the distribution of attack function capability, B, the distribution of vulnerability, and C, the distribution of defense, and they're not especially hypothetical. That said, it is focused on the availability of these technologies outside of government. And there is a conceptual reason for that, which is that, look, at least since the advent of organized militaries, the government has always had the ability to deploy massive force and violence against people that it felt like deploying violence against. And there is nothing especially new about, conceptually about that. there is something conceptually new about the idea that individuals can now reserve and use and hoard powers of violence that we traditionally associate with state-level actors. And so I think if you're thinking in sort of social contract terms, the ability of the government to do awful things locks in, no pun intended, the sort of social contract relationship, right? Whereas the ability of you at some very basic level to resist it and to act like a state in violence terms disrupts it. And so I think that's the reason to focus on that as the difference. Look, I am not making an argument for mass surveillance. The book treats in passing the sort of debates about NSA. It's not about that. And by the way, I'm not even sure Gabby and I agree on that subject. Have we ever really had that conversation?
We know we disagree a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I am broadly speaking, with certain caveats, a defender of most NSA programming of which I'm aware. That's not the subject of the book. So the mass surveillance, the platform surveillance discussion in the book arises out of a different question, which is, okay, let's say you have these new technologies that develop all sorts of platforms on which people can do things. New operating systems for developing, robotic, kinetic action in space that's available to you. The ability to manipulate the human genome, products that are sold to build genetic sequences, right? It follows, if you believe that threats will arise from distribution of these technologies, that somebody will want to conduct surveillance of the use of these technologies. That's the issue that gave rise to these NSA programs, right? You develop Facebook, lots of people use Facebook, somebody perceives the need to conduct surveillance of certain types of activities on Facebook. So our question was, when does such surveillance really come at the expense of liberty? When does it reinforce liberty? When is it neutral with respect to liberty? When is it legitimate, and when should we fear it? And I think the answer to that is, A, the more these technologies develop, the more space we have in which to do previously unthinkable things, the more pressure we're going to have for surveillance of certain categories of those activities. And so our question was, this is not really an argument for platform surveillance, but a question of when should we think of that sort of activity as legitimate and constructive, and when should we think of it as illegitimate and non-constructive?
The other thing is, there is a kind of an aesthetic element to this entire debate where every time we talk about surveillance and privacy, we talk about what the big brother is doing to us, right? Now, I said that in the same workshop that Yochai mentioned, that as far as I'm concerned, the NSA can read all my emails. I don't have a problem with that. I worry about my colleagues reading my emails. And I'm pretty sure that if my colleagues can't hack my email account, their teenage sons can certainly do that. And so what's always puzzling to me is when Ben and I have discussions about surveillance, I just assume it happens. And I assume it happens not just because the government is watching me, but because I get targeted ads on Google. And that really annoys me, I have to tell you. But this idea that the little brother can do whatever it wants, corporations, whether we give them information ourselves without even thinking about it or knowing, or whether they do it because they can and they have the market incentives to do it, that happens all the time. I don't hear people complain about that, not nearly enough. All the conversation is about the big brother, the big evil brother, the NSA is watching me. So again, I assume everybody's watching me, and I don't care if it's the government or I don't have a particular aversion to the government as opposed to Google on that end.
I wonder if I could ask you to step a little bit back from the more concrete discussions and think in political theoretical terms, in terms of a specific dichotomy. One of the arguments you've made is that state power can in fact increase liberty, and I think that that's correct. But we also know that state power can decrease liberty. Do you have something to say to us about the nature of the state that can increase power and at the same time increase liberty? So not in terms of the, I don't mean to suggest unimportant, but the narrower surveillance kinds of questions, but the more general political theory kinds of questions that one might ask.
Go ahead. Or I can if you prefer. Go ahead. So, look, the optimal amount of governance to maximize liberty is not zero. And this is the central insight of the Enlightenment political theorists. It's still true. In a liberal state, we all believe that. We argue about the margins of the point, but not since, I suppose there were elements of the New Left, but not since the turn of the last century has anarchism been a real big proposition. And so, I mean, look, the nature of the state that maximizes liberty involves a lot of the elements that Jack was talking about earlier. One is transparency. You have to know what it's doing and why. The justification for it has to be reasonably understood, reasonably accepted, and the individual citizen has to be able to make the calculation that the liberty that he's giving up or that she's giving up to the state pays dividends in some other liberty, right? That the giving up of X to the state's authority to rule enables some greater liberty to do Y. This is why police presence in neighborhoods that have good relations with the police, right, that don't fear the police, is thought of as liberty enhancing. Whereas in Ferguson, Missouri, the police presence is thought of as itself an oppressive presence, right? It's not a net plus for liberty, right? Because what you look at the state as giving and taking away is essential to that question, to your question. So to put it in the terms that Yochai presented, if you have a state that is, and Yochai and I will probably disagree about a lot of things related to post 9/11 response, but I don't think we disagree about the fundamental question, which is, is the state responding to real threats in a proportionate and reasonable fashion that is and open about what it's doing, right? Is there the consent of the underlying body politic, and is it within the norms that we accept that limit the state in all circumstances? And I think that there's a lot of give in all of that, but that's the essence of a liberal state.
Thank you. Hi, Naz Modirzadeh here at HLS. I wanted to maybe ask a question about law, and picking up on something that Yochai asked. As you both know more than most, there's been a very robust debate in academic and blogosphere on whether or not the distinction between war and not war matters anymore. And I wonder if you could just speak to how the book enters into that conversation. What do you think about how the threats you identify or the responses you would advocate to those threats, how does it relate to the debate over the legal distinction, at the very least, between war and law enforcement or not war? Thanks.
So this distinction has started to come under pressure, came under pressure before, but it started coming under greater pressure after 9/11, sort of the question of how bad does it need to be before you call it war? And of course, there's something self-perpetuating that once you decide to call it war, you also turn it into one. So the power is not just out in the objective world, but the power is also in your decision-making. Now, it goes back to our discussion about crime, how much crime we tolerate versus why is our psychological response and political response to terrorism is so different. Part of the answer is psychological, part of the answer is politically motivated. It turns out that there are higher dividends from being tough on terrorists than sort of talking about ordinary crime and then having to take up Second Amendment enthusiast. And so terrorism yields much more, benefits. We think about, in the book, about these distinctions. We think about the whole question of extraterritorial jurisdiction, the question of dividing up the domestic and the international domain. So we play with all of these. We ask, to what extent do motivations matter? How much should they matter? How much are you going to show deference to other states in regulating their own affairs? How much and under what justification can you engage in coercive activities outside your borders? Again, going back to the abductions or targeted killings debate, or even just surveillance. I don't know that we give concrete answers at the end of the day. The aim here is to show that all these conversations need to start happening. So when you have such a prolific debate over targeted killings, it's a good debate to have. It's an important debate to have. Now expand the lens beyond using drones in Yemen or Pakistan and start having a conversation about a much more sort of popular, if you want to say, or popularized use of drones for surveillance or for killing by far greater number of people for all kinds of purposes. Does that change your response? Does that change how you think or the positions you take within the original sort of targeted killings debate?
It's 1:15, and if you could stay a couple of minutes extra, maybe to take questions personally from the audience and sign books. I want to emphasize we have the coop here, selling copies of books. I'll go around, I'll pass the jar around again for you to put the slips in if you would like to try to win a copy, one of the 2 copies that we have on the desk. But otherwise, I think we should probably call it a day.
Thank you.
Thank you.